Welcome to the New Books Network.
What makes a person want to become a terrorist? Who becomes involved in terrorism and why? And how can people become deradicalized? Welcome to the Van Leer Institute series on ideas. I'm Renee Garfinkel. I'm honored to welcome today's guest, John Horgan, Distinguished University Professor in the Department of Psychology at Georgia State University and author of the new book, Terrorist Minds, The Psychology of Violent Extremism from Al-Qaeda to the Far Right. John Horgan, welcome to the podcast.
It's so great to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Renee.
John, your book is certainly timely, having been published just as an army of terrorists, Hamas, invaded Israel to commit unspeakable acts against women, men, children, and old people. This is the time for your research. So tell me, how has the field of terrorism research changed since you began working on the subject 25 years ago?
Oh gosh, it certainly has changed. I remember when I started properly doing terrorism research, it was around about 1996, 1997. And in some ways, it was a great time to do research on terrorism because there were so few scholars doing serious, sustained work on these issues. It became really easy to know who everybody was. So building a network, learning about who was doing what and where and how and why, etc., was easy to do. At the time, there were only I think there were only two professional academic journals that were publishing the research that was coming out. So it was a very niche subject, but it was also a very good time to get into this from my perspective, at least. I remember from my mentors and colleagues at the time, they were looking at me thinking, well, this is a strange area for a psychologist to be interested in. I think there was an assumption that this is the kind of thing that's the domain of political scientists. Therefore, why as a psychologist would you be interested in political terrorism and violent extremism and that kind of a thing? So, it's fun to think back to my time as a graduate student doing my PhD on terrorism, learning about research, learning about all of these different groups, and getting into terrorism research today is I think a very daunting prospect for just about anyone. I run a small lab here at Georgia State University, and I have a bunch of PhD students, and it's overwhelming. We have so many people now doing research on terrorism. We have so many different types of researchers doing work on different types of terrorism, and it has become almost impossible to keep up with the work that is coming out on terrorism and terrorists. And I say I really mean it when I say that it's almost impossible to keep up with it, let alone absorb and integrate and think about it. So it really is an area that has, if you'll pardon the expression, it has truly exploded over the past 20 years.
And I'm guessing it's not just that there are more researchers and more research being done, but there are also more and varied kinds of terrorism.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure, and you already know this as well as anybody. One of the defining features of terrorism is that it is always changing. It is always evolving. There are always new types of terrorism. It morphs and evolves and changes and in metastasizes in different sorts of ways. I think there is a sense today in which, and maybe this was always the case. I mean, I'm not sure I have that perspective yet, but certainly today, ironically, it has become even harder to figure out exactly what is terrorism and what isn't. It's one of those words that is consistently overused, and it's used in very hypocritical and inconsistent ways. So it can be increasingly more challenging to figure out what constitutes terrorism and what doesn't. Here in the US, for example, there is a constant refrain whenever we see or hear of the latest mass shooting to call it terrorism. And there are some cases where that is warranted, but for the most part, we still all struggle to accurately and consistently characterize acts of targeted violence as they should be.
Well, let's follow that. What distinguishes violent extremists from mass killers who have no political or religious agenda, like school shooters or serial killers for that matter?
The short answer is ideology. It all boils down to ideology. Now, when I say ideology, I mean an organized set of beliefs that is shared by a group. Sometimes that group can be very, very small. Sometimes that group can be, can be tens of thousands. It can be an entire community or series of communities. But ideology is the distinguishing feature here. So when I talk about terrorism, I'm talking about the use or even the threat of use of violence against civilians for some social, political, religious, or other ideological agenda. If there's no ideology present, then it cannot be terrorism. It has to be something else.
Then can you distinguish with that definition terrorists from other group violence, let's say gangs? They don't have a very sophisticated ideology, but they have one.
Yes, they would say that they have one. It's a gray area for sure. I mean, gangs like terrorist groups will sometimes control territory. They will have power in numbers. They will recruit very often in the same ways. In terms of entry and exit processes, we see lots and lots and lots of similarities. It might be for some that this is an issue of scale. I mean, the aspirations that gangs have to change the social order, for example, I think that would be overstated. I mean, gang concerns are far narrower than the agendas typically held by terrorist groups, where it's about upending or causing some sort of upheaval in the prevailing social or political system. Gang concerns tend to be far, far narrower.
Let's talk about the people who do research into the phenomenon of terrorism. In the book, you use the analogy of storm chasers to the study of terrorism. Explain that.
Yeah, I guess it's one of the things I've struggled with. I mean, explaining terrorism is super hard. I've been studying terrorism for over 25 years, and any of your listeners might think, this guy's been studying it for 25 years and he still can't figure it out. But the honest answer is I can't. I think it's a very complex social process. I mean, my small part of the puzzle here is to try to understand how and why and where and when people are drawn into it and what kinds of experiences they have and what they do as terrorists and ultimately how and why they get out. Now, the reason I say that that's my part of the puzzle is that those are the kinds of things I study. I could study those sorts of things without ever paying any sorts of attention to the bigger forces out there, the social, political winds of change that make terrorism more or less likely in a given community or in a given country or between one country and a community or whatever it is. The storm chasers analogy is I wanted to draw a parallel between terrorism researchers and people who, quite frankly, chase tornadoes. There are people who study tornadoes and storms from very different perspectives, whether it's people using satellite imagery to figure out storm systems emerging and forming, versus the storm chasers, the people that are on the ground and will actually go into the eye of a storm just to try to get a closer view. In the book, I talk about, on the one hand, why thinking about tornadoes and terrorism in the same vein is helpful. I mean, both are phenomena that attract our attention. They have the potential to cause massive death and destruction, and we can't help but be fascinated by them. But the perspectives that we can bring to studying either of those phenomena can differ very, very, very substantially. So if you like, it's the storm chasers, it's the people who flock to this activity. Those are the ones I'm interested in, and I'm on the ground trying to understand what is it locally that's pushing and pulling them into it. But that's a very, very, very different perspective. For example, if we continue with this analogy, than a political scientist or a sociologist or an anthropologist would take from studying this phenomenon from a much broader perspective. So it's I use this term storm chasers, but the question that drives my research isn't so much why do people become involved in terrorism? It's why is it that so few people do it? Given that the political, social, and other conditions that are out there, the winds of change, if you like, if to continue this analogy even further, given that so many people are exposed to these conditions, why is it that so very, very, very few will actually take that extra step and get involved?
So, do you think that under the right conditions, everyone is capable of violent extremism,
I
or
used to
not?
The great question. I used to think the answer to that question was yes, that any of us in the right circumstances could get involved and could, want to take a step up and get revenge on behalf of ourselves or our families or our communities or whatever it is we're claiming to represent. Over the past several years, I've come to change my views on that. I don't think terrorism is for everyone. You see lots and lots of people they'll talk the talk, they will support terrorism, they will point to the actions of states and say that look at what state actors do. It's 100 times worse than what our small little tiny group might be capable of. Therefore, don't condemn us, condemn the bigger aggressor. I think the issue here is about trying to understand why, like I said, why so few get involved. But in speaking to those people who do get involved, we hear very, very interesting accounts, and this is where I think we're better able to answer this question. There are lots of people who think about getting involved in terrorism. There are lots of people who will say, I want to do something, I want to play my part, but violence isn't necessarily for everyone. If there's one thing we know about studying terrorism is that there are lots of different ways in which you can help out. You can raise money, you can spread propaganda online, you can help the cause in many, many different sorts of ways. No shortage of examples of people who dabble in violence and then decide, you know what, I'm not entirely sure this is for me. That's for somebody else in the group. So that's a terribly long-winded answer to your question, but no, I don't think it is for everyone. I think people. There are a lot more people out there who think about this and who will rationalize violence to themselves and to others, but there's a far smaller subsection that are willing to actually go and cross that threshold.
Well, you mentioned online, so let's talk a little bit about some of the ways terrorists are recruited, both online and in person, because that's the first way of separating those who will go on to become violent from those who might like the presentation but say it's not for them.
Correct. So some of the most effective terrorist groups are ones that are able to acknowledge that there's a role for everybody, that there are many different ways in which people can get involved and can essentially help out. I think the internet has and social media in particular has fundamentally changed how we understand terrorism and how we understand people's involvement in it. In the pre 9/11 days and pre-internet days, for you to be involved physically, you had to travel to a conflict zone. You had to essentially grow up in an area that was controlled in many cases, or at least heavily dominated by the presence of a particular terrorist group. You had to know someone physically. You had to be able to walk to a location and declare your intent to get involved and do something. In some circumstances, that's still the case. We see recruitment as a very localized phenomenon. You have clusters of people in particular neighborhoods who get involved because they know each other through friendship networks, etc. But over the past 20 years, the ways in which people have been able to become involved have utterly changed. Now it is just as easy for someone in rural Georgia in the United States, for example, to declare his or her allegiance to a particular terrorist group from 7,000 miles away. I mean, as far as the social media is concerned, the distance is concerned have shrunk to almost nothing. So lots more opportunities for people to help out and do things in different ways. It's sort of confused the meaning of what it means to be involved. So clearly, giving money to a cause, spreading propaganda, it's not the same as engaging in acts of violence. But is that person any less involved in terrorism? Not necessarily.
No, it's enabling, which, yeah.
Correct, and it also, so I mean, it has allowed groups to project a much bigger footprint than they ordinarily would. It allows them to engage in psychological warfare to a much greater degree. It projects an image to the world that this group is far bigger, far more powerful, and its tentacles extend far further than anyone might have anticipated.
Yeah. Our image of a generic terrorist, regardless of cause, is that of a male. But there are female terrorists too. What do we know about gender and violent extremism?
I think it's one of the many blind spots people have had about terrorists in general. There have always been female militants in terrorist groups. I mean, dating back hundreds and hundreds of years. Some groups in the 1970s, for example, were completely dominated by women. So I think the ways in which we think about gender and terrorism is probably a microcosm of gender stereotyping more broadly. But yes, I will concede to your point. I mean, most people's image of a terrorist is a young male, 18 to 24, angry, isolated, alienated in some way, and then all of the other qualities and dynamics that comprise the terrorist. I think that notion is outdated. Today, it's men, women, and children, all ages, all backgrounds, all walks of life, all religions, all creeds, getting involved in different sorts of ways, having very different kinds of experiences, because, again, like I said earlier, what it means to be involved in terrorism today, might mean doing different sorts of things. And how and why those people get out of groups might also look and feel very, very different from one person to the next.
You mentioned a study in the book, and I don't remember offhand when it was done. It was a study of Palestinian terrorists where the research found that male terrorists emphasized ideology and women personal revenge. And also their means of being recruited were kind of different. Do you know what I'm referring to?
I do. So that study was very, very interesting because it's, I'm sure your listeners will be frustrated to hear me say again, but this is a complex topic. We wish it weren't so, but this is a really, really good example. So what that study found was that it's very difficult to understand precisely what motivates terrorists, even when they are willing to sit down and talk with us about the reasons they become involved. So when we speak with terrorists about why they do what they do, they'll give different kinds of answers. Some might express their motivation in terms of the group's ideology, the intent, and they might say things like, well, this is not about me. This is about the enemy. This is about our oppressor. This is about us being downtrodden and victimized. And at a certain point, you can only take so much, and you have to hit back. That's a very typical kind of answer we get from someone who parrots the ideology of the group. It's not to say that it is incorrect or doesn't reflect how that person feels, but it reflects the ideology of the group. Other people, or the same people at a different time, will also open up about their personal motivations. And this is where things get a little bit tricky because on the one hand, we're saying, well, look, it's the ideology that separates or distinguishes terrorism from other forms of violence. But when we ask people about why they get involved, some people will couch their motivation in terms of the ideology. But if you spend enough time with people, or in the cases of some interviewees, they might be a little bit more forthcoming, then you start to get a much more complicated picture. Yes, it's about the ideology, but it's also about the personal. It's also about the what might be driving someone to want to belong to a group. They might be getting involved because their friends are involved, their family is involved. They might feel that it would bring them some sort of hero status in the community, and that might be what's really is pulling them in. The short answer is we don't know exactly what the precise recipe is for pulling or pushing someone into these groups. It's probably some combination of all of it. I think the thing that I've been struck by is that I think we've probably overstated the ideology part of this. Because we know, I mean, and people will tell us, terrorists will tell us that in many cases people get involved because their friends are getting involved, that it's just the thing to do in the neighborhood or in the community, and there's a sort of a status afforded with being involved, and they just find themselves, just going with the flow.
And
Those I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead. Complete.
I was just going to say, those same people, though, who might not necessarily have gotten involved for ideological reasons, can find themselves becoming more ideological the more time they spend in the group. So in plain English, the more time you spend in one of these groups, you learn to talk the talk, you learn how to couch what might initially have been, something that wasn't very special or interesting at all. Hey, I just got involved because my friends were involved. Now it has become something much more powerful. Now that the person has acquired the means to tell you or me or someone else why it is they're doing what they're doing.
Do we know much about the differences between the lone wolf terrorists, such as the murderer at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and organizational affiliated, group affiliated terrorists that you've been talking about?
I think we do. They're not as dissimilar as one might think. I think this goes back to your point earlier about how the internet has changed things. I think true lone wolves are very, very, very rare indeed. And I think we've tended to call them lone actors because I think lone wolf makes them sound a little bit cooler than they really are.
Right.
But lone actors are people who will decide to act in the name of a cause or a community or an agenda that is still widely shared by others. Now, there are some groups like the Islamic State, for example, that has encouraged lone actors abroad to act out locally. So in other words, they're saying, look, if you cannot get here, if you cannot come to our territory that we control or controlled, then it is your responsibility, your duty to act out at home. So they're still acting on behalf of a community. They're still acting on behalf of an idea, a group, an agenda. They're just acting. They're formulating a plan on their own. They're deciding, often, sometimes with the help of others, but often out of their own sense of opportunity or local knowledge to attack a particular target. So there are some differences, but by and large, I think the similarities outweigh the differences. A very, very intriguing difference, though, emerged several years ago and was highlighted by a colleague of mine, Paul Gill, a political psychologist. Now, Paul and his colleagues found that incidents of mental illness seemed to be somewhat higher among lone actors than among group affiliated terrorists. To this day, we're still not entirely sure why that's the case. I mean, we know that it is a finding that has garnered evidence. So we know that it appears to be real, and there appears to be a real difference there. But why it is the case, we're not entirely sure. I think the explanations behind it have been somewhat lacking. And there, no shortage of all kinds of theories as to why that's the case. Maybe groups have some way of siphoning out people who might appear to present with mental illness, or maybe there's something else, but a lot of ongoing research in that space for sure. But the one thing I would really, really drive home about that is that lone actors are not nearly as alone as we might think. Whenever accounts appear in the media of a lone actor terrorist, you really have to wait about 6 or 7 more weeks, and investigations then tend to uncover another key person or a recruiter online, or there's more to it very often. The true lone actors are exceptional and very, very rare.
What role does the pornography of violence play in terrorist recruitment and support? I'm thinking of Islamic State broadcasting beheadings, or Hamas terrorist army posting videos of their grotesque atrocities on October 7th.
It plays lots of roles. It plays lots of roles. I mean, it is about it's about causing fear, anxiety, terror in the short term. It's about humiliating the targets, and by humiliating the targets, I'm talking about not just the civilians that are targeted, their loved ones. It's about undermining a confidence in the government and making them feel helpless, making them feel that they cannot protect the population that they were elected to serve. We often talk about terrorism being a form of psychological warfare, and that's one of the key dynamics that underpins that. There's another set of factors here as well. So it's about sending a message within their own group to say, look, no, this is just a reminder. We are capable of striking our enemies, sometimes in a very dramatic way, and look at what we are able to do with limited resources. In terms of the terrorist groups' foreign audiences, I mean, of course, it is about causing anxiety, fear, and terror on a much, much broader scale. But it's about making all of us feel vulnerable, feeling that we can all be at the wrong place at the wrong time and killed in the name of some cause that we might not even be aware of. So I think there is a profound value in not just doing these acts, but in choreographing them, in capturing them, and in now making virtual pseudo participants of all of us when we see these videos, and we are, all of us are victimized over and over again by exposing ourselves to them.
Absolutely right. The trauma of watching it is a secondary trauma that
sure.
can be very destructive.
And make no mistake about it. Terrorist groups on the one hand will say, they'll go to great lengths, often internally, to say, we don't want to engage in this violence. We have no choice but to do it. This is the only language the enemy understands. What they will not say publicly is that they know that for some members, the violence is the draw. That is the proverbial juice, if you like. There are people out there who seek out involvement in terrorist groups because they want to attack, they want to rape, they want to behead people. This is what drives them.
Yeah, sadism,
correct.
And power dominance,
and the bigger groups, like I say, they're your Hamas, ISIS groups of that caliber who have the experience, they have the ability to draw people in from different walks of life. They will cater to different kinds of people. Some terrorist groups were very historically were very I guess, choosy about who they took in and why. But today's terrorist groups will take in virtually anybody, but they will assign particular roles to those people very often based on their psychological makeup.
John, your book deals with research into the individual psychology of terrorists. So the next question goes beyond the data, but I'd like you to reflect on what I'll call cultural pathology. What maintains entire cultures of terrorism where violent extremism is celebrated, it's even taught in schools, it's honored, even when it seems to the outsider to undermine the culture's material self-interest?
I think there's a few factors that maintain it. It's not just the internal factors, but it's also the external factors that will also sustain it. One of the most unenviable tasks faced by countries or states or governments when responding to terrorism is doing so in a way that doesn't make the problem even worse. Now, there is not a single government that has ever existed that has responded to terrorism, I think, without making it often substantially worse. And of course, we're back to this point about psychological warfare. When states find themselves engaging in extra legal activities, engaging in acts where civilians will get killed, this simply feeds the sense of purpose and urgency in the terrorist community to do even more. So it becomes a never-ending spiral of reciprocity that both sides, ironically, will feed on.
And finally, John, some terrorists do change and reject their former violence and extremism. What do we know about that process?
We know that just as there is a steady stream of people who want to become terrorists, there's also a steady stream of people who want to get out. We speak to people who get out of terrorist groups because we want to know why. The main reason behind why they want to get out is disillusionment. They are either fed up with the lifestyle, they realize that it's not all that it's cracked up to be, they're burned out, they're disillusioned in some way, but that's the main reason why people want to get out of terrorism.
Yeah, we need some more of that.
We sure do. And it's a process we've only relatively recently started to study. And I think most people who study terrorism do it from the front end. How do people get involved and why, and what do they have in common, et cetera, et cetera. But we can learn so much by interviewing and listening to people who get out, because we're afforded greater insights into what life is like in these groups, and we're able to contrast that with the propaganda that the groups put out. And we can, if we are clever about it, we can distill those lessons and try to figure out what we can do on the front end to prevent the next generation from getting involved. I'm making it sound very simplistic when I put it like that, but that's the logic behind why we want to learn more and more and more from people who get out of these groups.
And it's very important work. The book is Terrorist Minds, The Psychology of Violent Extremism from Al-Qaeda to the Far Right. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me today, John.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
And thanks to our researcher, Bela Pasikov.